All right, everybody, get ready, cause today we're going deep, like way back in time, deep, to explore the history of anthropology.
Really diving into the heart of how this whole field came to be.
Right, and I think it's so cool how, we were fascinated by different cultures even before we had a name for it.
Oh, absolutely. It's like human curiosity 101,
Yeah.
wanting to understand how other people live, what they believe.
Totally. So before we get to like the big names, your Boas, your Malinowski, who were some of those early figures who were laying the groundwork without even realizing it.
Okay, so one figure I always find fascinating is Herodotus. Writing like way back in the 5th century BC, he traveled all over ancient Greece, parts of the Persian Empire even.
Talk about an overachiever.
Seriously. And he wasn't just sightseeing either. He was documenting everything, different customs, languages, beliefs, even those crazy festivals they had. He's like the OG anthropologist.
Wow, I'm picturing him with like a little notepad and sandals jotting down observations.
I know, right?
Oh,
And it's not just the Greeks either. You've got someone like Ibn Khaldun, a scholar from 14th century Tunisia.
okay. Now that's a name I haven't heard before.
Yeah, he's not as widely known, but he was doing some seriously groundbreaking work. He was analyzing societies, historical change, even things like group dynamics. Honestly, his stuff reads surprisingly modern, even though he was writing centuries ago.
It makes you wonder what insights got lost to history, right? Like what other brilliant minds were out there just waiting to be rediscovered.
Well, I'm sure there are tons. But anyway, getting back on track, one thing that really got the ball rolling for anthropology as a formal discipline was, well, it's a bit of a complicated legacy.
Uh-oh, I sense a but coming.
Yeah, well, you can't talk about the history of anthropology without acknowledging the impact of European colonialism.
Right, the whole exploring new lands, encountering different cultures thing. It's a sensitive topic for sure.
Definitely. And it's important to remember that many early anthropologists were products of their time, with all the biases and assumptions that came with that era.
It's like that idea from the chapter about how we interpret the past through the lens of the present. Like, we can't escape our own baggage.
Exactly. And that baggage definitely shaped how early anthropologists approached other cultures. There were a lot of, let's say, problematic ideas floating around back then about primitive versus civilized societies.
Right, that whole social evolution thing.
Exactly. They were trying to fit everything into these neat little boxes, these stages of development, which, as we know now, is way too simplistic.
Definitely. But even with those flaws, it still feels like a crucial step, right? Like trying to make sense of all this diversity.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't all bad. You had figures like Lewis Henry Morgan, who, despite some of his assumptions, was doing some really important work on kinship systems, how families are structured in different cultures.
It's just fascinating stuff. Like, who knew there were so many ways to be related to people?
Right. And those early attempts to grapple with cultural differences, even if flawed, were essential steps in the development of the field. Kind of like you got to crawl before you can walk, right?
Totally. And speaking of taking those first steps, I'm curious about those early debates, like the whole nature versus nurture thing. Was that already a hot topic back then?
Oh, absolutely. It's like one of those fundamental questions that has always fascinated us. Even Herodotus, remember our Greek overachiever? He noticed this custom among the Calations, a group in ancient Scythia.
Okay, hit me with it. What did the Calations do?
Well, when a Calatian man died, they would prepare his body
Yeah.
and then, get this, eat a portion of his remains as part of the funeral rites.
Whoa, okay, that's a little intense.
Right. And Herodotus was like, yeah, the Greeks think that's totally barbaric, but the Calations are like, hey, it's how we honor our dead.
So already back then, they were wrestling with these big questions about how we understand and judge different cultures.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about studying the history of anthropology.
Yeah.
It's like we're still grappling with those same questions today, just in new and more nuanced ways.
So we've met a few proto-anthropologists, those early adventurers and thinkers who were already asking big questions about culture. But now we're entering what feels like, the golden age, late 19th, early 20th century. What's in the air? What's changing?
Well, think about those bustling universities, those expeditions heading off to all corners of the globe. It's an exciting time. This is when anthropology really comes into its own, a real discipline now, not just, armchair speculation.
Right, like we're getting out there, getting our hands dirty. So who are the big names, the ones who really shaped the field as we know it?
You can't talk about this era without mentioning Franz Boas.
Oh, yeah. I remember that name from my intro to anthro class, wasn't he? Like the champion of cultural relativism.
That's the one. He really pushed back against that whole evolutionary hierarchy thing, judging cultures based on some Western yardstick of progress.
Which, thank goodness we're over that now, right?
Right. Boas is like, hold on. Every culture has its own internal logic, its own history, its own way of making sense of the world.
So instead of ranking cultures, we're trying to understand them on their own terms.
Exactly. And Boas walked the walk. He did extensive field work among Inuit groups in the Arctic, learned their language, lived among them.
Wow, that's dedication.
Oh, totally. And it wasn't just about collecting data. He was really challenging those racist assumptions that were so prevalent at the time. He was like, look, these cultural differences, they're not biological. They're the product of history, of environment, of all these complex factors.
Speaking of getting up close and personal with a culture, wasn't Bronislaw Malinowski another big proponent of fieldwork?
Oh, absolutely. Malinowski practically wrote the book on fieldwork. He took Boas's ideas about understanding a culture from within and really ran with them.
Okay, so tell me more about his approach. What made it so groundbreaking?
Well, he believed in really immersing yourself in the culture you're studying, like really immersing yourself. He spent years living among the Trobriand Islanders in the Pacific, learned their language, participated in their rituals, even documented get this, their intricate system of exchange called the Kula Ring.
The Kula what now?
This is fascinating. They would travel for miles across these islands, trading these necklaces and armbands, not for any practical purpose, but really as a way of building relationships, maintaining social ties.
It's amazing how these seemingly simple acts of exchange can reveal so much about a culture's values.
Right. And Malinowski argued that you could only really grasp those complexities by actually living among the people, participating in their daily lives.
So it's not just about observing from a distance, it's about really experiencing it firsthand.
Exactly. He called it participant observation, and it became a cornerstone of anthropological fieldwork.
So we've got Boas laying the theoretical groundwork, Malinowski showing us how to put it into practice. Who else is shaping the field during this time?
Well, we can't forget A.R. Radcliffe Brown. He was a bit of a counterpoint to Boas and Malinowski.
Oh, how so?
Well, if Boas and Malinowski were all about the uniqueness of each culture, Radcliffe Brown was interested in finding those universal laws, those underlying structures that govern all societies.
So kind of like searching for the common denominator of human social behavior.
Exactly. He was a big proponent of something called structural functionalism.
Okay, I'll admit that one sounds a bit intimidating.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Essentially, he believed that you could understand a society like a human body. Each part, each institution, has a function in maintaining the whole.
Interesting. So give me an example. How does that play out in a real culture?
So take kinship systems, for example. Radcliffe Brown would argue that different kinship structures, like who you're allowed to marry, how you trace your lineage, all of that serves a function in maintaining social order and regulating relationships within a society.
So it's like, even though cultures might look very different on the surface, underneath it all, they're all grappling with these same fundamental challenges of how to live together, how to organize themselves.
Exactly. Now, one more figure we can't leave out from this era is Marcel Mauss, a French anthropologist who actually never did any fieldwork himself.
Wait, no fieldwork? That seems kind of, I don't know, off-brand for an anthropologist, especially during this golden age of exploration.
I know, right? But Mauss was brilliant in his own way. He was a voracious reader, devoured ethnographic accounts from all over the world.
So instead of going out into the field himself, he's piecing together these grand theories from other people's research.
Exactly. He was like a detective, looking for patterns, for connections, for those underlying threads that tie everything together.
So what were some of his big ideas? What did he uncover in all that reading?
Well, he's probably most famous for his work on gift giving.
Gift giving, like birthday presents and holiday exchanges, that's a whole field of study.
Oh, absolutely. Mauss argued that gifts are so much more than just material objects. They're about creating social bonds, reinforcing hierarchies.
So like that obligation you feel when someone gives you a gift and you have to give them something in return.
Exactly. It's about reciprocity, obligation. It's about cementing social ties.
Wow, it's amazing how these four figures, each with their own unique approaches and personalities, really shaped the trajectory of anthropology.
They really did.
Yeah.
And their work, as groundbreaking as it was just the beginning. Like any good story, things are about to get even more interesting and maybe a little messier.
Okay, so we've met the founding fathers, so to speak, those big names that really put anthropology on the map. But I'm getting the sense this is just the tip of the iceberg. What happens next in our anthropological adventure?
Well, the story of anthropology is like any good family saga, right? You've got the pioneers, the ones who built the house, but then the next generation comes along, wants to renovate, put their own stamp on things.
Ooh, I like where this is going. So who are those next generation anthropologists shaking things up?
Well, one name you'll hear a lot in this era is Claude Lévi-Strauss, a real intellectual heavyweight. Imagine like a French philosopher, obsessed with patterns, with trying to decode the hidden structures of human thought. That's Levi-Strauss in a nutshell.
Okay, that sounds both intriguing and a little intimidating. Give me the crash course. What's he all about?
Well, he was a structuralist, which basically means he was trying to find those universal patterns, those underlying structures that shape how we think, even across vastly different cultures.
So even if cultures seem like worlds apart on the surface, he's searching for those deep underlying connections.
Exactly. He was heavily influenced by linguistics, the study of language, and he saw cultures kind of like languages themselves, with their own internal grammars, their own rules for how you put things together, how you make meaning.
So even those crazy myths and rituals that seem totally foreign to us, he'd say there's a hidden logic to them, a structure we can decode.
That was the goal. He even analyzed those myths from around the world, tried to show how they actually share these underlying structures, these common themes that reflect universal patterns in human thought.
It's like our brains are wired to think in certain ways, no matter where we come from, what culture we're raised in.
That was the gist of it. Now, not everyone was totally on board with this whole structuralist approach.
Yeah, it does seem like it might be missing some of the, I don't know, the messiness of human experience.
That was a common criticism. Like, where's the individual in all this talk of grand structures? People like Edmund Leach and Raymond Firth, they were more interested in agency, how individuals navigate those structures, how they make choices, how they sometimes even subvert the rules.
Right, because we're not just robots following some pre-programmed code, right? We're constantly pushing boundaries, reinterpreting traditions.
Exactly. And speaking of pushing boundaries, remember those 19th century ideas about social evolution? Yeah, well, those weren't gone for good.
Oh, you mean like Morgan and his stages of development? I thought we'd move past that.
Well, in the mid-20th century, you get this kind of neo-evolutionism emerging. Anthropologists like Leslie White and Julian Stewart, they were revisiting those ideas about material factors like technology and the environment, shaping cultures, but in a much more nuanced way.
So less about ranking cultures on some imaginary ladder of progress and more about understanding how they adapt to their surroundings.
Exactly. They were interested in how different societies interact with their environment, how they use technology to solve problems, how they adapt to different ecological niches. It's a much more dynamic and, honestly, a more respectful way of understanding cultural change.
It definitely feels like we're moving away from those simplistic either-or binaries, embracing complexity.
That's a great way to put it. And this is also the time when Marxist thought starts to have a big impact on anthropology.
Okay, Marxism, as in Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, all that, how does that fit into the picture?
Well, anthropologists like Eric Wolf and Sidney Mentz, they were really influenced by Marx's ideas about power, about inequality, about how economic systems shape our lives and relationships.
So it's not just about studying cultures in isolation, it's about understanding those broader forces, those systems of power that connect us all.
Exactly. They were looking at things like colonialism, globalization, the impact of capitalism on different parts of the world. They were interested in how power operates both within and across cultures, and how those power dynamics shape everything from economic systems to social hierarchies to our everyday lives.
It really does feel like anthropology is finally grappling with the real-world implications of its own work, right? Like we're not just studying cultures as if they exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. And this leads us to another really pivotal moment in the field's history, the emergence of feminist anthropology in the 1970s.
Okay, tell me more. This feels like a big one.
It was huge. For decades, anthropology had been this largely male-dominated field, mostly men studying other cultures, often through a very particular and somewhat limited lens.
I can imagine there were some blind spots in that approach.
You could say that again. So feminist anthropologists like Sherry Ortner and Michelle Rosaldo, they came along and said, hey, wait a minute, you're telling only half the story here. Where are the women? Where are their voices? Where are their experiences?
Right. It's like they were finally shining a light on those untold stories, those perspectives that had been marginalized or ignored.
And it wasn't just about adding women to the narrative. It was about fundamentally challenging those assumptions about gender, about power, about how we do anthropology itself.
So it really was a turning point, a wake-up call for the field.
Absolutely. And This focus on gender, it opened up space for other critical perspectives to emerge as well. You had anthropologists focusing on race, on class, on sexuality, all those factors that shape our experiences within a culture.
It's like anthropology is finally getting to the heart of what it means to truly understand another culture, recognizing the diversity of experiences within any given society.
Right. And that brings us to anthropology today. It's more diverse, more globally engaged than ever before. It's not just about studying those exotic cultures anymore. It's about using those anthropological tools, those ways of thinking, to understand the complexities of our increasingly interconnected world.
So, what are some of the big questions anthropologists are tackling today? What does that look like in action?
Oh, everything from climate change to globalization to the impact of digital technologies on our lives. Anthropologists are working in all sorts of settings, from remote villages to bustling megacities, from government agencies to tech startups, you name it.
It's incredible to see how far the field has come from those early musings about cultural differences to this dynamic, globally engaged discipline that's grappling with some of the most pressing issues of our time. It really highlights the enduring power of understanding different cultures.
It really does. And, the best part is the story's not over yet. Anthropology is constantly evolving, constantly adapting, and I think that's what makes it so exciting, so relevant. There's always something new to learn, always a new perspective to consider.
Well, what a journey it's been. We've gone from ancient Greece to the digital age, from armchair anthropologists to those doing cutting-edge research all over the world. It's clear that anthropology is much more than just studying the past. It's about understanding the present and maybe even shaping the future. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those big questions, and keep embracing the incredible diversity of human experience. We'll see you in the next deep dive.